Chapter 16 of Ruth Fielding at the War Front. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ruth Fielding at the War Front by Alice B. Emerson. The Hollow Tooth. Boo Boo had been running at large, and in the daytime. He had come from the north. Ruth believed the dog had crossed the lines and just now had arrived at the chateau after his long and perilous journey. Yet for a greyhound, the 15 or 20 kilometers between the chateau and the battlefront was a mere nothing. The rate the girl had seen the werewolf flying over the fields, he must have covered that distance faster than an automobile, and, too, he would take a route much more direct. The Countess seemed to have forgotten Ruth's presence, but the girl could not well draw her arm away and remain behind. Besides, she was desperately eager to know what would be done to Boo Boo, or with him, now that he had returned to the chateau. It was not unwillingly that the girl accompanied the Countess. It was some distance around the great building to the rear. They came upon the excited Dulge and the big dog, the latter lapping water out of a pan near the well-house. "Non, non," cried the Countess warningly, "not that, Dulge. He must not be allowed too much cold water after his so exciting run. It is not good for him." The gardener stooped to take the pan away, and the greyhound growled. "Ooh la la," mumbled Dulge, "name of a mouse! Would you butcher me, you of bloody mind?" Ruth noticed that the barrel of the greyhound was almost white, which assisted in giving him that ghostly appearance at night. The Countess left Ruth and hurried forward. She did not stoop, but with her foot she straightway overturned the pan, sending the water out on the stones. The dog looked up at her, wide-mouthed and with tongue hanging, but he did not offer to molest her. He only dropped his head again, and with his pink tongue sought to lap up the moisture from the stones. "The collar, Dulge," commanded Madame la Comtesse. The old man hobbled forward with a wide leather strap attached to the chain. The strap was decorated with big brass rivet heads. She buckled it around the neck of the panting dog. He lapped her hands. "Ah, naughty one," she murmured. "Would you run the fields like a wild dog? The blanket, Dulge. He may take cold." Already the gardener was bringing the covering. They fastened it around Boo Boo, who finally shook himself, and would have lain down had not the Countess said sharply, "Nay, nay, all is not finished, Boo Boo. Open thy mouth. So." She forced open the big dog's jaws. Rather at a touch, he allowed her to hold his dripping jaws apart. "Dulge," she demanded decisively, "can you see?" "Oui, oui, madame," the old man chattered, shaking his head vigorously. "But not for me will he keep his jaws apart. I am not to be made into sausage meat, I hope." The Countess laughed at him. "Hold his mouth open, then. He would not desire to bite. But—" Ruth, amazed, saw her white fingers fumble inside the dog's open maw. She pulled what seemed to be a white rubber cat from one of his grinders. Quickly and skillfully, with a fine knitting needle, the Countess ripped from this rubber casing what the girl thought looked like a twist of oiled paper. "All right, my good Dulge, you may let him go," she said, hiding the twist of paper in her palm. "Let him rest. Poor fellow." She patted the greyhound with the sole of her slipper, and the big dog yawned, then laid his head upon his paws. He was still panting, his sides heaving heavily. His legs and feet were bedaubed with mud. "He has come a long way," the Countess said coolly to Ruth. "Let us go in, mademoiselle. It must be that our tea is ready." She seemed to consider Ruth quite worthy of her confidence. The American girl knew that she was on the verge of an important discovery. It could not be that Boo Boo carried messages to Germany to give aid and comfort to the enemy. That suspicion was put to rest. Boo Boo was being used to bring news from French spies across the battle lines. Otherwise, the Countess would never have allowed Ruth to discover this mystery of the werewolf. And how shrewd was the method followed in the use of the obedient dog, a hollow tooth which would be overlooked even if the enemy shot and examined the animal. Ruth wanted to ask 100 questions, but she did not open her lips. It might be that the Countess supposed she was already aware of the use made of Boo-Boo, and how he was used. The American girl had been brought to the chateau by Monsieur Lafrène, the agent of the French Secret Service Bureau, and the Countess knew, of course, his business. As soon as they were in the library, where the tea things were laid, the Countess proceeded to smooth out the bit of paper and examine it under a strong reading-glass. "Ah!" she cried in a moment, her smooth cheeks flushing and her eyes brightening. "He is well, my dear boy." Her joy urged Ruth to question her, yet the girl hesitated. Her eyes, however, revealed to the Countess her consuming curiosity. "Mademoiselle," exclaimed the old lady, "do you not know?" I don't know what you mean, madame," stammered Ruth. "It is from the Count, my Allaire." "The message is from Count Marchand?" cried the girl in utter amazement. "But yes, he does not forget his old mother. When able, he always sends me word of cheer. Of course," she added, looking at the American girl curiously now, "there is something else upon the paper. His message to his mother is not a line. You understand, do you not? Monsieur Lafrène, of course—" "Monsieur Lafrène has never told me a word," Ruth hastened to say. "I only suspected before to-day that Boo-Boo carried messages back and forth across the lines." "Ah, but you are to be trusted," the Countess said cheerfully. "We do what the Anglais call—how is it?—our little bit, Boo-Boo and I. He, too, is French," and she said it proudly. "And for years, mademoiselle, we have established this couriership of Boo-Boo's." She laughed. "Do you know what the farmers say of our so-good dog?" Ruth nodded. "I have heard the story of the werewolf. And really, madame, the look of him as he runs at night would frighten anybody. He is ghostly." The Countess nodded. "And that's his safety, and has been since before the war. For, you know, mademoiselle, all France was not asleep during those pre-war years when the hateful Hun was preparing and preparing. My husband, Mademoiselle Fielding, was a loyal and far-sighted man. He did not play politics and seek to foment trouble for the Republic as so many of our old and noble families did. Now, thank Heaven, they are among our most faithful workers for la patrie. But see you, Count Marchand owned a small estate near Mers, which is just over the border in Germany. Sometimes he would go there, sometimes to drink the waters, for there are springs of note, perhaps for the hunting, for there is a great forest near. He would always take Boo-Boo with him. And so he taught Boo-Boo to run back and forth between here and there. He carried messages around his neck in those times, quite simple and plain messages, had he been caught at the frontier and examined. It was our Henri who resorted to the hollow tooth, and that since the war began. Boo-Boo had one big tooth with a spot on it. Henri knew an American dentist in Paris. What cannot these Americans do? And the Countess laughed. We took Boo-Boo to Paris and had the decayed spot drilled out. The tooth is sound at the root. The dentist made the hole as large as possible, and then we molded the rubber caps to close it. You see how the messages are sent." "Remarkable, madame," murmured Ruth. "But, who sends the messages from beyond the German lines? Now it is Count Allaire himself," she hastened to explain. "In disguise he went through the lines some weeks ago. The agent who was there came under suspicion of the Germans. And he lives at the castle over there in Germany." "Openly?" gasped Ruth. Nay, it is no castle at best," and the Countess laughed. "It is by no means as great a place as this. It was a modest little house, and is now the comfortable quarters of a fat old Prussian general. But upon the estate is the cottage of a loyal Frenchman. He was a gardener there in my husband's time. But as he bears a German name and his wife is German, they have never suspected him. It is with this old gardener, Brothard, my son communicates, and it is to him our good Boo-Boo goes." "But how can the dog get across no man's land?" cried Ruth. "I do not understand that at all." "There are bare and bleak places between the lines which we know nothing about," the Countess said, shaking her head. "Not in all places are the two armies facing each other at a distance of a few hundred yards. There is the lake and swampland of Savoy, for instance. A great space divides the trenches there, all of 2 miles. Patrols are continually passing to and fro by night there, and from both sides. A man can easily get through, let alone a dog. Hush," she added, lowering her voice. "Of course I fear nobody here now. Poor Bessie, who was faithful to me for so many years, was contaminated by German gold. But she was half German at best. It was well the poor soul escaped as she did. However, my remaining servants I can trust. Yet there are things one does not speak of, mademoiselle. You understand? There are many good men and true who take their lives in their own hands and go back and forth between the enemy lines and our own. They offer their lives upon the altar of their country's need." End of chapter 16.